The laughter echoing across Riverside Plantation on that sweltering Georgia afternoon in 1856 was not the sound of joy or celebration. It belonged to Mistress Victoria Ashford, who stood on her columned veranda, mocking the dying gasps of an enslaved woman named Mama Celia, who lay in the dirt courtyard below. Her life was slipping away from injuries inflicted during a whipping that Victoria had ordered for the crime of being too ill to work. The sound of that cruel laughter, mixed with Celia's labored breaths, marked the moment when a dying woman's curse took shape. A supernatural force so potent that it would transform Victoria, once one of Georgia's most feared plantation mistresses, into a crippled figure crawling on hands and knees for the rest of her days, begging for the mercy she had never shown. If you are prepared to witness one of the most terrifying stories of supernatural justice in American history, where a dying woman's final words unleashed a force that would ruin her tormentor, hit the subscribe button now. Give this video a like and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because what Mama Celia unleashed with her last breath will make you question the limits between the natural and supernatural worlds and reveal the fearsome power of a curse spoken by someone with nothing left to lose. The curse that would forever alter Riverside Plantation had been brewing for decades in the mind and heart of a woman whose knowledge of conjure traditions gave her access to spiritual forces that white authorities dismissed as primitive superstition, but which were among humanity's oldest and most potent forms of resistance. Mama Celia, 68 years old and dying from internal injuries that would have killed a younger person instantly, used her final moments to weave together spiritual forces that would ensure Victoria Ashford experienced every suffering she had inflicted over 30 years of systematic cruelty. The year was 1856, and the Georgia-Piedmont region had become one of the South's most lucrative cotton-producing areas, its red clay soil yielding crops that enriched plantation owners while working enslaved people to exhaustion in conditions designed to break both body and spirit. Its proximity to Charleston and Savannah made it a hub of the domestic slave trade, where humans were bought and sold like livestock, all while there. Oppressors congratulated themselves on bringing civilization and Christianity to those they deemed inferior. Riverside Plantation sprawled across 6,000 acres of prime cotton land along the Oconee River, its edges marked by towering pines that had watched 4 generations of human exploitation masquerading as agricultural progress. The plantation house, an imposing Greek revival mansion with massive Corinthian columns and intricate ironwork, rose from this land like a monument to blood money. Its grandeur showed that fortunes could be made on the systematic destruction of human lives. Mistress Victoria Ashford, 48, widow of Colonel Thomas Ashford, who had died 3 years earlier, leaving her as sole owner of Riverside and its 350 enslaved people, combined the refined cruelty of a Southern lady with the raw brutality of overseers who saw violence as the only way to maintain control. Tall and imposing, with steel-gray hair always styled in the latest Charleston fashion and pale blue eyes seemingly incapable of recognizing suffering in darker-skinned faces, she had transformed Riverside into what enslaved people called the plantation of tears, where psychological torture mattered as much as physical punishment. Victoria's reputation across the Georgia-Piedmont was complicated. She was admired for her business skill in running a large plantation without a man, and whispered about for cruelties that shocked even experienced plantation owners accustomed to violence. Her talent for torment lay in identifying each enslaved person's deepest fears and exploiting them, all while keeping up the appearance of refined, ladylike behavior. The enslaved population lived under conditions combining brutal labor with psychological warfare, administered as eagerly as some women might pursue needlework or social visits. The slave quarters were crude wooden structures without proper space, ventilation or sanitation, breeding diseases that killed 1 in 3 children before their 5th birthday and left survivors with lifelong health problems. Among them, Mama Celia held a unique position as spiritual leader and keeper of ancestral traditions that linked Riverside's community to African ancestors whose wisdom survived the Middle Passage. Born in coastal Georgia in 1788 to a mother brought directly from West Africa, Celia had inherited deep knowledge of conjure practices combining African, Native American, and folk Christian traditions into a sophisticated system for influencing spiritual forces. Her education began in childhood, guided by her mother and grandmother, both recognized as powerful root workers whose knowledge of herbs, rituals, and spiritual forces made them indispensable to enslaved communities, while marking them as dangerous in the eyes of white authorities. From them, Celia learned to identify hundreds of medicinal and magical plants, craft ritual objects to channel spiritual energies, and create curses capable of devastating anyone who harmed her people. These spiritual practices were far more than primitive superstition. They were a system for understanding and influencing the invisible forces shaping human existence, refined over centuries by African priests and medicine workers. The ability to curse was one of the most dangerous and morally complex aspects of this tradition, reserved for situations where conventional resistance was impossible and the evil addressed so profound that supernatural justice was the only option. Victoria Ashford's cruelty toward Celia had been growing for years, fueled by the mistress's fear that Celia's spiritual authority challenged white dominance. Their confrontations included Victoria forbidding African traditions while Celia secretly taught younger generations, punishing people who sought her healing while she treated them anyway, and attempting to crush her spirit through increasingly severe punishments, all while Celia preserved her dignity through sheer will. The fatal beating occurred 3 days before her death, when Victoria discovered that several enslaved women had visited Celia for gynecological treatments that the plantation physician ignored or could not handle. Victoria interpreted this as defiance of white authority and ordered Celia whipped. The overseer delivered 50 lashes under Victoria's direct supervision outside the main house so she could watch, ensuring the punishment was both visible and severe. Each stroke tore flesh with force sufficient to cause internal injuries that would prove fatal despite her decades of surviving lesser brutalities. But what transformed this violence into a catalyst for supernatural revenge was Victoria's reaction. Instead of maintaining cold efficiency, she mocked Celia, laughing at her cries and making cruel jokes about how someone who claimed healing powers couldn't save herself from the consequences of defying white authority. "Where are your spirits now?" Victoria called from the veranda, watching the bloodied woman below. "Where are your roots and conjure tricks when you actually need them? Maybe you should have spent less time filling others' heads with African nonsense and more learning respect for your betters." Her laughter carried across Riverside, cutting deeper than the whip itself. For those enslaved who looked to Celia as a spiritual protector, seeing her humiliated was an attack on an entire system of beliefs that had sustained them through slavery. But Victoria did not realize she had created the perfect conditions for a powerful curse, one spoken by a dying person whose final breaths were entirely devoted to calling down justice without concern for earthly consequences. The dying curse is considered the most dangerous form of conjure because it merges spiritual power with the moral authority of someone whose suffering gives them the right to demand retribution. Celia lay in the courtyard for 3 days, enduring agonizing pain while Victoria forbade meaningful medical care or even basic comfort, leaving her where she fell as a lesson about defying white authority. Victoria ate her meals on the veranda, forcing Celia to watch her enjoy comforts created by the old woman's labor. During those 3 days, Celia used every moment of consciousness to prepare her most complex curse, drawing upon 8 decades of knowledge and righteous anger from a lifetime of witnessing and experiencing cruelty. The curse was designed to attack on multiple levels. It would destroy Victoria's body in ways mirroring the suffering she inflicted on others, strip her of dignity and social status, and ensure her torment was witnessed by those who had watched Celia's humiliation. It called upon ancestors who died under slavery, nature spirits controlling invisible forces of destiny and divine justice beyond human law. Only a master practitioner could weave such forces while dying from internal trauma. Physical elements of the curse were gathered during Celia's last days. Loved ones secretly brought items within reach, graveyard dirt to connect with the dead, river roots to channel water's destructive power, nail clippings and hair from Victoria collected over months, and finally Celia's own blood as the ultimate sacrifice to fuel supernatural forces. Enslaved people gathered secretly at night, conducting prayer vigils disguised as Christian services, building spiritual energy for Celia to channel in her curse. The singing, prayers, and laying on of hands all added power for her final act. On the last afternoon of Celia's life, Victoria emerged to the veranda for her midday meal, positioning herself to watch the dying woman while enjoying food prepared by enslaved cooks. She invited neighboring plantation ladies, treating Celia's suffering as appropriate entertainment. The white women sipped lemonade, discussed Charleston fashions, and glanced casually at the black woman bleeding in the courtyard below. They might show toward any unpleasant but necessary part of running the plantation. "She's still breathing," one of the visitors noted with mild surprise. "I would have thought 3 days without food or water would have finished her by now." "She's a tough old woman," Victoria replied with clear satisfaction. "But that only means she has more time to reflect on the results of her defiance. Every hour she spends dying in that courtyard is an hour that my other slaves are learning what happens to those who think they can practice their own religions on my property." The curse that Mama Celia had been preparing during those 3 long days reached its peak as the afternoon sun began sinking toward the Georgia horizon. The old woman's eyes, which had been closed for hours, suddenly opened with a sharpness and intensity that seemed impossible for someone so near death. Her mouth, silent except for occasional groans of pain, began to move as she spoke words in languages that blended West African, dialects with Native American tongues, and fragments of biblical verses twisted into forms serving magical purposes rather than Christian worship. The enslaved people who had been secretly keeping watch understood immediately that Mama Celia was entering the final stage of her work, the moment when gathered spiritual energy would be focused and sent toward its target with the full power of a righteous soul's dying breath. They had witnessed smaller curses before and had heard stories from older generations about the terrible strength of a dying curse properly carried out, but none had ever been present for anything of this scale. The words Mama Celia spoke grew louder and stronger despite her weakening body. Her voice seemed to draw energy from sources beyond the physical as she called upon every spiritual entity with reason to support her purpose. The ancestors who had died in chains, the spirits of the land desecrated by slavery's violence, the divine forces that recognized truth and demanded justice. All were invoked and bound into the curse that would be released in the moment of Celia's death. Victoria noticed the noise and rose from her luncheon table to look down at the dying woman with a mix of contempt and unease. "Someone silence that," she shouted to the overseer. "I won't have my meal interrupted by an old slave's ranting." But before anyone could move, Mama Celia lifted one trembling hand and pointed straight at Victoria on her veranda above. The gesture was unmistakable, and the words that followed would be remembered and repeated by every enslaved person at Riverside for generations. "You who laughed at my dying," Mama Celia's voice rang with supernatural clarity. "You who mocked my pain and made entertainment of my suffering. The spirits have heard your laughter, and they will repay it with your screams. Before 3 days pass, Your legs will betray you, as your heart has betrayed all mercy. You will crawl in the dirt, as you made me lie here. You will beg for aid from those you tormented, and you will know fully the helplessness you imposed on others. This I curse with my dying breath by the power of the ancestors, by the justice of the spirits, and by the righteousness of my cause. So let it be." The silence afterward was complete, as if the entire plantation had frozen in expectation. Mama's hand fell to her side. Her eyes closed for the last time, and with a rattling breath that seemed to carry her spirit to the other world, she died in the dirt, where Victoria's cruelty had left her. The laughter Victoria forced from her throat in response to the curse was hollow, uncertain, lacking the genuine malice that had marked her earlier mockery. "Superstitious nonsense," she told her guests, though her voice carried an edge of worry not present before. The old woman died ranting, as uneducated slaves often do when they've lived long and learned little about the outside world. But even as Victoria spoke dismissively, she felt a strange tingling in her legs, which she would later recognize as the first sign of the supernatural force about to transform her life into a living nightmare. The curse Mama Celia unleashed with her last breath was about to prove that some forms of justice went beyond earthly power, and that mocking the dying could carry consequences no amount of wealth or status could prevent. The spiritual training that had prepared Mama Celia to deliver Georgia's most powerful dying curse began 60 years earlier on the Sea Islands near Savannah, where her grandmother, a woman called Ayaba, born in Dahomey and surviving the Middle Passage with her spiritual knowledge intact, recognized in young Celia the qualities needed to carry on traditions European enslavers had tried desperately to destroy under the ancient live oaks draped with Spanish moss, in secret clearings where the spirits of the land met the spirits of Africa. Ayaba taught her granddaughter that true strength came not from physical force or social standing, but from understanding invisible forces governing life and learning the languages to command them. Mama Celia's journey, from frightened child to master conjure woman, spanned 8 decades of wisdom, suffering, and spiritual growth, shaping her into someone able to wield supernatural forces with the precision of a surgeon and the righteousness of a prophet. Her mother, after Ayaba's death, when Celia was 12, continued her education in Georgia's coastal marshlands, where enslaved people preserved African religious practices under the guise of Christian worship, creating a blend of traditions more potent than either system alone. The foundations of the conjure work Celia mastered went beyond herb lore and folk remedies that white observers dismissed as quaint superstition. They represented a deep understanding of how consciousness, intention, and spiritual energy could be focused and directed to influence events in the material world. The methods involved learning altered states of consciousness to communicate with ancestors and spirits, understanding correspondences between physical objects and spiritual forces, and most importantly, developing moral clarity to wield power without succumbing to corruption that destroyed those who practiced for selfish or trivial purposes. The ability to curse, to send destructive spiritual energy toward a target, was the most dangerous and morally complex aspect of conjure tradition. Ayaba taught Celia that cursing was never to be done lightly, requiring certainty that the target deserved supernatural punishment, and that the practitioner must accept karmic consequences, potentially spanning lifetimes. But Ayaba also taught that cursing could be morally necessary when evil was extreme and earthly justice absent, where supernatural intervention was the only path to accountability. The dying curse Celia prepared during her final 3 days represented the pinnacle of these lessons, a working drawing upon every technique she had learned over 8 decades, channeling the spiritual power of ancestors who died under slavery's brutality. The curse was designed with scientific precision targeting Victoria's nervous system to progressively destroy her ability to walk, while leaving her mind fully aware to experience each moment of degradation. Victoria Ashford's rise as one of Georgia's most feared plantation mistresses was gradual, shaped by Charleston society, where she learned enslaved people were inferior and their suffering either divinely ordained or irrelevant to white morality. Her particular genius for cruelty developed after marrying Colonel Thomas Ashford, whose approach to slave management mixed systematic violence with psychological manipulation to break spirits while maintaining productivity. The brutality education Victoria received from her husband was deliberate, as he believed plantation mistresses had to be as ruthless as men to control enslaved domestic workers. He taught Victoria that any sign of mercy would be seen as weakness, that consistent cruelty was essential for psychological control, and that suffering should be treated as a management tool rather than evidence of shared humanity. The specific cruelties defining Victoria's 30-year reign at Riverside were carefully calibrated to maximize psychological impact while maintaining the appearance of refined, ladylike behavior. She created what she called domestic discipline, a system of constant surveillance of houseworkers, unpredictable punishments for minor faults, and public humiliations to destroy dignity or self-worth that might support resistance. The punishments Victoria favored showed her deep understanding of inflicting suffering beyond physical pain, targeting the psychological foundations of identity. Mothers were separated from children, not for economic reasons, but as punishment for perceived defiance. Enslaved women were publicly stripped and examined to enforce submission while demonstrating Victoria's control over every aspect of their lives. She applied rules inconsistently to maintain constant anxiety, so enslaved people could never predict what would trigger punishment. But Victoria's signature cruelty, involved mocking and humiliating those who were sick, injured, or dying, treating suffering as entertainment rather than tragedy. She became notorious across the Georgia Piedmont for her cruel wit at the expense of vulnerable slaves, joking about their pain to delight other mistresses, shocking even seasoned overseers who knew it served no practical purpose beyond satisfying Victoria's sadistic urges. The conflict between Victoria and Mama Celia had been growing for decades, rooted in the clash between white authority demanding total submission and African spiritual traditions, affirming sources of dignity and power beyond slavery's control. Victoria understood early that Celia was a threat, providing enslaved people hope and spiritual tools that challenged white supremacy and black helplessness. Victoria's campaign against Celia took many forms, all aimed at undermining the conjure woman's authority, forbidding possession of ritual items, searching quarters for herbs and charms, punishing those seeking Celia's healing or guidance, and forcing public renunciation of African practices in favor of Christianity, preaching slave obedience. But each attack met quiet resistance from Celia, who continued her arts in secret while teaching younger generations that African traditions held wisdom and power, predating European colonization and destined to survive slavery. Celia's refusal to be broken enraged Victoria in ways normal disobedience never did because it challenged the mistress's belief in her power to control every aspect of enslaved lives, including their spiritual practices. The final incident leading to Celia's fatal beating was Victoria discovering that enslaved women sought her treatment for gynecological issues rather than seeing the white plantation physician. This was the last straw in a conflict escalating for years. Victoria interpreted these visits as organized resistance, proof that Celia's influence undermined the submission she considered essential for control. The decision to have Celia whipped to death was made. With full awareness of the consequences, Victoria knew that the elderly woman's body could not survive the brutal punishment the mistress intended to inflict. The beating was designed not just to punish Celia, but to destroy the hope her spiritual leadership had offered to Riverside's enslaved community to show that African traditions and those who practiced them were powerless against white authority backed by law. What Victoria did not realize, however, was that she had unintentionally created the exact conditions needed for the most potent type of conjure, a dying curse spoken by a righteous practitioner whose suffering gave her the moral power to demand supernatural justice without fear of earthly consequences. The 3 days that Celia had spent dying in the courtyard while Victoria mocked her had allowed the conjure woman enough time to prepare a curse that would devastate her tormentor far beyond what Victoria could have imagined. The first sign of Mama Celia's curse appeared just hours after her death. Victoria began to feel a strange tingling in her legs, which she first dismissed as a result of standing too long on the veranda watching the dying woman. But the sensation did not fade. Instead, it grew into a burning that traveled along her nerves from her feet up to her hips, accompanied by sudden muscle spasms that made her legs jerk involuntarily. By the evening of the first day after Celia's death, Victoria had developed a noticeable limp. She assumed she had twisted her ankle, though she could not remember doing so. The limp worsened during the night, forcing her to hold onto furniture for support as she moved through Riverside's main house. Her usual commanding gait had reduced to a shuffling hobble. On the second day, the symptoms intensified. Victoria awoke to find her legs so weak she could barely stand without help. The burning sensation had become actual pain, radiating from her lower back through her hips and down both legs. Her muscles seemed to have lost the strength to support her weight. The plantation's physician, summoned urgently from his home 10 miles away, could find no medical explanation for the sudden onset of what looked like paralysis or severe neurological dysfunction. Dr. Edmund Cartwright, a respected physician with 30 years of experience, was bewildered. And you want to follow how Victoria's torment unfolds as Mama Celia's curse continues to destroy her life. Show support by liking this content and subscribing. Share where you are watching from and whether you believe in the power of curses. The stage was set for the full vengeance of Mama Celia. The curse that began with Victoria's paralyzed legs would eventually reduce her to crawling on hands and knees, begging mercy from the people she had spent decades tormenting. Victoria Ashford's deterioration over the weeks after Celia's death defied medical explanation. The curse progressed, forcing her to crawl through the same courtyard dirt where Celia had suffered, transforming her from paralyzed invalid to crawling supplicant. By the 4th week, Victoria's paralysis spread to her lower back and core, making it impossible to sit upright even in the specially designed chair. Dr. Cartwright, increasingly alarmed, recorded symptoms that contradicted every neurological principle of the time. Her arms and hands remained strong, while her legs and torso weakened, as if some unseen force selectively destroyed certain muscles while preserving others. "It's as if her body is being prepared for something specific," Dr. Cartwright confessed to Victoria's relatives. "The pattern makes no medical sense. The slaves call it a curse, and I'm beginning to wonder if they might know something science cannot explain." The family rejected the idea of supernatural intervention, but privately even the skeptics recognized the uncanny resemblance between Victoria's suffering and Celia's dying curse. Her legs betrayed her, her independence vanished, and she faced a destiny that forced her to crawl in the dirt. 6 weeks after Celia's death, the curse reached its climax. Victoria woke from a nightmare about Celia's final moments and felt an irresistible compulsion to go to the courtyard where Celia had lain. Despite paralyzed legs and a weakened torso, she used her arms to drag herself across the floor, down the veranda steps, and into the courtyard. The enslaved woman assigned to assist her awoke to witness this, along with others who arrived just in time to see Victoria crawling toward the spot where Celia had died. The plantation community saw a scene that would be remembered for generations. Mistress Victoria Ashford, once powerful, crawled on her hands and knees through the courtyard dirt, her nightgown dragging, her hair loose, her body reduced to the same degradation she had inflicted on Celia. The curse also forced her to reenact the suffering Celia endured. She could not stop crawling until she reached the exact spot where Celia had lain, collapsing face down in the dirt. Victoria's mouth spoke words not her own, recounting in detail the cruelties she had inflicted over 3 decades. The enslaved community recognized the fulfillment of Celia's dying curse, a supernatural working that turned their tormentor into a vessel for ancestral judgment. The voice spoke private acts of cruelty, secret violence, and betrayals Victoria had thought hidden. "I sold a mother's child out of spite," the voice confessed through her. "I ordered whippings for amusement, denied medical care, and I delighted in cruelty. I mocked the dying because their pain gave me a sense of power. For 30 years I proved to the world, and to myself, that I was a monster. But now the spirits had come to demand payment for every tear I caused, every drop of blood spilled, every moment of suffering I had inflicted without mercy or regret. The psychological torment Victoria endured during this forced confession went far beyond any physical punishment that human cruelty could have imagined. She remained conscious throughout, aware of every word that escaped her lips against her will, understanding that she was being used to reveal truths that would shatter her reputation and authority. A woman who had spent her life controlling every detail of her world was learning that some forces could strip that control completely, reducing her to a puppet whose strings were pulled by powers that answered to no earthly law. The peak of Victoria's supernatural punishment came when the force that had driven her to the courtyard finally released her. She collapsed into the dirt, fully aware of her surroundings and of everything that had just happened. Her legs and torso remained paralyzed, leaving her in the humiliating position of someone crawling on the ground, unable to rise or even sit upright without help. Around her, dozens of enslaved people watched, their expressions a mix of satisfaction, fear, and awe at the unseen forces at work. Trying to return Victoria to her bedroom revealed the final cruel twist of the curse. The strength she had used to crawl to the courtyard had left her completely. The muscles that had carried her across floors and downstairs now refused to respond. She was utterly immobile, entirely dependent on the enslaved people who lifted and carried her as if she were an infant. The woman who had wielded absolute power for decades could no longer move a limb, feed herself, manage her bodily needs, or even turn her head without help. Physicians examining Victoria after her crawling episode could offer no medical explanation for the events or her sudden total paralysis. Dr. Cartwright, who had been documenting her case with growing unease, finally acknowledged that what he was witnessing went beyond medical understanding. Victoria's condition was not illness, but judgment. It was not a mystery, but a moral reckoning imposed by forces beyond earthly law. "I can no longer claim this is within my expertise," the doctor admitted to Victoria's family. "What has happened to Mrs. Ashford defies every medical principle I've learned. The timing, the progression, every detail suggests intelligence and intent beyond natural causes. The enslaved believe she was cursed by their conjure woman, and I can no longer dismiss that as superstition." The consequences of Victoria's condition and forced public confession spread across the Georgia Piedmont. Neighboring plantation owners heard the story and began to view their enslaved workers with new caution. The thought that conjure traditions could genuinely harm white authority challenged fundamental beliefs about the permanence of slavery, suggesting the oppressed had access to powers their oppressors could neither understand nor control. At Riverside, the enslaved community underwent a transformation after Victoria's public humiliation. People who had lived their entire lives in fear began to feel a new confidence. Those who had never dared to look Their overseers in the eye now met their gaze boldly. Work songs that had been mournful took on tones of triumph, and the plantation's atmosphere shifted from pure terror to a complex mix of fear, hope, and empowerment. Perhaps the cruelest part of Victoria's punishment was the knowledge that she would live with the consequences of her cruelty for the rest of her life. Mama Celia's curse had not killed her. Instead, it condemned her to years of helplessness and degradation, dependent on the very people she had tormented. Death would have been mercy, but Victoria received a long life filled with the suffering she had inflicted, fully aware of every indignity. Victoria, who had mocked dying slaves, now lay paralyzed in the same courtyard dirt where her victims had perished, pleading for mercy from the very people she had abused. Mama Celia's dying words had proven real, and some curses could indeed reshape lives. For 17 years, Victoria's condition transformed Riverside Plantation from a prosperous cotton estate into a place haunted by memory and justice. The woman who had ruled with cruelty existed in total helplessness until her death. Her daily state was a reminder to the enslaved community that the ancestors watched, that evil would face judgment, and that Mama Celia's curse had succeeded where earthly authority had failed. Victoria's paralysis was complete, leaving her fully aware and cognitively intact while entirely dependent on the enslaved people for every bodily function. What modern medicine would classify as quadriplegia, Riverside's enslaved community recognized as perfect judgment from the ancestors. Daily care fell to women who had once been her victims. She could not eat, bathe, dress, or manage any need without their help. The woman who had mocked, humiliated, and dominated now lay helpless, and her caretakers subtly reminded her that her suffering was divine justice, not misfortune. Sarah, one of Mama Celia's closest spiritual students, became Victoria's main caretaker. She had once sought Celia's healing services, which had prompted Victoria's cruelty. "I care for her because Mama Celia would have wanted it," Sarah explained. "The curse isn't about becoming like her. It's about showing that we are better. We show mercy not because she deserves it, but because that is who we are. Every day is proof that slavery didn't destroy our humanity the way it destroyed hers." Victoria's paralysis immediately disrupted Riverside's operations. Her family lacked her authority and knowledge to maintain control. Overseers made concessions unimaginable during her reign. Economically and socially, the effects rippled across the Georgia Piedmont. Plantation owners, even those who dismissed African spiritual traditions, began to acknowledge privately that these practices held real power. Dr. Cartwright continued his visits, documenting Victoria's condition. His journals, preserved in Georgia Historical Society archives, reveal his growing belief that her condition might indeed have supernatural causes. "I spent 30 years believing all ailments had physical causes," he wrote. "Mrs. Ashford's case forces me to question that. The timing, progression, and symbolic precision of her affliction suggest intelligence beyond biology. These African spiritual traditions may access forces European science cannot yet recognize. Mama Celia's curse influenced resistance movements throughout the South. Oral traditions carried the story, giving hope to enslaved people that justice could emerge from unseen forces." Harriet Tubman reportedly visited Riverside, speaking to the community about the significance of Celia's curse, showing that ancestors actively worked to dismantle slavery. The Civil War, beginning 5 years after Victoria's paralysis, was interpreted by many formerly enslaved people as the fulfillment of accumulated curses and prophecies. Victoria lived to see slavery's end, witnessing her former property become free citizens, while remaining trapped in the body Mama Celia's curse had created. She died in 1873 at age 65, after 17 years of complete paralysis, her life a living testament to supernatural accountability. Victoria's funeral was sparsely attended by white society, but widely observed by the black community, not in mourning for her, but in recognition of Mama Celia's power. Sarah, who had cared for Victoria, spoke at a remembrance in the slave quarters. Mistress Victoria spent 17 years learning that lesson, and we spent 17 years being her teachers. That was Mama Celia's gift, not just revenge, but proof we possess power slavery could never take away. The courtyard where Victoria had crawled became a pilgrimage site for formerly enslaved people and descendants, later transformed into a memorial garden marking Celia's grave, with an inscription affirming that some curses are real. Modern historians have documented extensive testimony showing a consistent and symbolic account of events that challenges assumptions about natural versus supernatural causes. Scholars such as Dr. Marcus Washington have noted the case's significance in understanding spiritual resistance to slavery. Whether interpreted as supernatural or natural, the story of Victoria Ashford serves as proof that those who seem powerless may hold hidden resources. It reminds us that mocking the dying can have consequences beyond the limits of life and death. Mama Celia's curse challenges us to think about justice and resistance in ways beyond ordinary understanding, showing how spiritual and moral power can reshape history. If this story of supernatural revenge, accountability, and ancestral power inspires or moves you, share it with others. Remember that some forms of justice operate beyond courts, and that the final words of the dying can carry a power that changes lives and shapes history.